Hello, my freelance and physics students. This time we're going to look at projectile motion. One of my favorite things in physics is projectile motion, just because of just the sheer awesomeness of how much you can figure out from very little information. Plus it has to do with all sorts of stuff we use on a daily basis and sort of in life in kind of our modern world. Understanding projectile motion is really, really important. So I have a scenario set up here. Let's say that you chuck something at a 30-degree angle, and you needed to hit a target that was exactly 100 meters away. And so you're going to chuck something at a 30-degree angle, and you wanted to hit that target. How hard, with what velocity would you have to throw it? So actually, this is all the information you have. You have a 30-degree angle, you have a 100-meter target, and these are the questions that we'll be able to answer once we learn how to do projectile motion. We'll be able to answer how long will it be in the air, the initial velocity needed, and how high it will go at its highest arc. Okay? So we'll get back to those questions in just a second. But when you chuck something into the air, it creates a path which essentially, let's see, gotta turn on that layer. It creates a path which goes like this, right? And that path is always an arc like this. It sort of always follows this kind of path. Now the reason for that is when you chuck something into the air, you're gonna have two velocities there. You're gonna have a velocity that is up, and you're gonna have a velocity that is over. Okay, so here's my velocity vector in the horizontal motion, and this is my velocity vector in the vertical motion. So let's call this Vy, and let's call this Vx. Okay, so now the important thing to know with projectile motion is that the velocity in the vertical direction has the effect of gravity on it. Okay, so gravity affects anything that goes up. But gravity has no effect on the horizontal motion. So that literally means if you shoot a bullet out of a gun and you drop the bullet from the gun, the one shot and the one dropped will hit the ground at the same time. Because the horizontal motion is totally separate from the vertical motion. And if this is dropping from this height, gravity is going to affect the bullet dropped and the bullet traveling sideways at the same exact acceleration. All right, and so whenever you're doing any projectile motion question, your biggest thing is to take and to divide up your vertical direction and your horizontal direction, and so we can call that our Vx and our Vy. All right. And so our distance, and so let's get a couple of formulas here that will come in handy. Our distance is always going to equal then, because what is our distance? Our distance is how far we need to go. So our distance is always going to be our velocity in the x direction times our time, right? So if I'm going 5 meters per second in the horizontal direction and I travel for a second, well, my distance is going to be 5 meters, right? So the distance always equals that velocity in the x direction times our time. And my velocity in the y direction, we have another formula for that. And so actually we could just use this one. Velocity final equals velocity initial plus acceleration times time. Well, what we need to do is we need to say our velocity in the y direction eventually is going to be 0, right? And our velocity in the initial direction, okay, we don't know, plus our acceleration. Our acceleration is going to be negative 9.8 meters per second squared times our time, right? And so you could say this. You could say velocity in the y direction equals negative 9.8 meters per second squared times negative velocity times our time. Now there's some other things you could do as well. You could take the You could take the some other equations and morph these into some other stuff, and we'll get to that later. But there's all sorts of things you can do because you know the acceleration that's going to be acting on this velocity in the y direction. And so, you might just need to figure out the time. Or maybe you can figure out the time knowing the acceleration. Maybe there's some things that you can do. All right, so, so in the next video, what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to answer these three questions. How long is it in the air? And the initial velocity that's needed and how high in the air it will go. All right, so stay tuned for that, and we'll answer some of those questions in the next video, and that'll help you with all these projectile motion sort of questions. But remember, the biggest thing about projectile motion is this: separating out your vector into a y vector and an x vector, because gravity will act on this one, and then this one is going to tell you your distance. All right. All right, so, and we'll do more and more of these as we go along, so lots of example problems.